Good evening and a warm welcome to viewers from all over the world. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the CEO's Chair is a unique program where we showcase inspiring stories of successful CEOs. We give you an insight into their mindset and discuss not only their challenges, but also help you understand their definitions of success and leadership. Today is our 49th episode, and we have another special CEO guest with us today, Vijay Anand, founder CEO at the Startup Center. Vijay, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Siddharth. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Vijay. So, Vijay, before we get started, just a few lines of introduction for those in the audience that may not be very familiar with your background as well. You are, and we'll talk about this, you're known as the startup guy. You're one of the original pioneers of the Indian startup ecosystem since 2004. You founded India's first startup showcase platform, Proto.in. You're currently the head of the incubator at the IIT Madras campus. You're also spearheading the community in Chennai, and you are the partner, like we mentioned, at the Startup Center as well. So,
Vijay, the IIT role was a previous role, but yeah, currently I'm working with the Startup Center. Yeah.
Okay, and you're still very much actively involved, from what I can see, both offline and online, in the startup ecosystem in Chennai.
Looks like it. Yes, I am.
Good. So, Vijay, have you always been interested in startups, or did you ever consider a professional career somewhere earlier in your journey?
So, I know a lot of the people that I meet these days actually seem to be very clear about that they want to be an entrepreneur. I didn't know that I was an entrepreneur for a long time. So when I was in college, I know that when we were growing up, me and my brother used to do a lot of things at home to, make money here and there, because my mom raised us in, a very complex methodology where she basically was very keen on teaching us the cost of capital and things like that, for example. Yeah, that's a long story by itself. But I think when I graduated from school and I wanted to go to college, I basically said I want to go to Canada for my studies for my undergrad. My parents sent me off saying that, we'll pay for the first year fees because that's what, that is the equivalent of what I would pay for an education here in India. And you'll have to figure out all the rest of the stuff there. But when I was in Canada and I was doing my part-time jobs and things like that, I believe it was the Business Development Corporation, BDC.ca, which ran a quiz basically saying that, here are 13 things to figure out whether you're an entrepreneur. And I think it was like this 15 minutes between classes where I was sitting there and basically taking that and say, so that's what I am. So I think the realization dawned much later, but I kind of have been doing a whole bunch of things building up to that point where we've always been about building things and value creation.
Of course. And your mother sounds like a lady ahead of her time. If she was teaching you, to conserve capital from a very young age, which I think is extremely important.
Yeah, very much so. My mom is a superwoman.
And where did the nickname, the startup guy, come from? Did somebody refer to you as that, or is that something that you just coined yourself?
So I am one of those unfortunate souls who has a name which is very, very common. I am the Joe Smith of India. And I think increasingly people keep asking hey, have you spoken to Vijay? And which Vijay? And I think Avinash Raghava, who now runs iSpirit, he basically used to started referring to me as Vijay, the startup guy, and I think that's how it kind of basically stuck. And I realized that, hey, this is this seems to be a way to go about it. And I think over a period of time, that became an interesting nickname and an introduction to things. So I said, well, I guess this is one way to differentiate which Vijay I am.
And that's almost become like your middle name. And I see you using that across social media as well. So it's a great identity to have.
Yeah, I figured out embrace it because I think that was also a couple of things that was happening where I started seeing, because I'm fairly active on social media, people starting to create very similar names and all those things. And I said, okay, this is one way to differentiate and make sure that, that brand identity gets built over a period of time.
Absolutely. So, Vijay, one of my other leading questions to startup is that, we've got everybody right from the government downwards talking about thinking local, building local, but you're actually one of those, and I hate to use the word, but I'm going to use the word startup evangelists that say that a startup founder needs to have a global mindset from day one. Now, what exactly do you mean by that? And is that something that a startup founder can actually inculcate?
Right. So I am a strong believer in the whole Indian economy booming and things like that, right? But
Right.
I think as an entrepreneur, you also have to realize that market timing is not something that we as individuals control at all, right? So
True.
there is a larger story that is panning out saying that, India will become a $5 trillion economy. But when is that going to happen? Like, how will it happen? Or there are a lot of ifs and buts that are there in place. I know that as a part of our journey, I think all of us have to play a part in that. But as an entrepreneur, when you're looking at, okay, what am I building for what market? I think, don't have too many uncertainties that are actually going on, right? And I think the key to basically also getting India to a $5 trillion market is also about, like, how do you build and basically cater to a global audience? And there is a lot of domain expertise that we have. Like, for example, the reason why Chennai is a SaaS capital today is because there is this large number of BPO and captive development centers which have been building for businesses across the world, for the last 20 years. And now all that, acumen is built up there. And one of the key things that you really can't learn in when you're building a SaaS business is deep domain knowledge. Okay. So, all these, middle level and senior managers who've been basically building for the largest insurance companies, the largest banks, the largest marketing companies in the world, now that they have this, 10, 15 years of experience, now they're basically coming back and saying, the problem that insurance companies in Europe have, this is what they have, and I can build a product for that, right? The key is that global markets pay a lot more. And I think when you're starting to do pricing, you can basically do value instead of doing, you can do the value pricing model rather than the cost plus profit margin model, which is the India model. And I believe that as Indian entrepreneurs, I would say that you have a obligation to basically start building global products, because when you build global products, you also end up uplifting the whole value chain in India, right? Like, we will basically help Indian B2B companies and B2C companies to basically adopt processes, which is the reason why B2B companies in India don't scale much enough. So when those tools are all built up, I think we will all be ready for that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great thought. And I've heard, unfortunately, way too many mentors or advisors of startups that tell you to build for the Western market. But I don't think, and just because they don't want to deal with Indian customers, and the perception is that Indian customers don't pay. But I think the focus should be more on the value of the product and the value of the problem that you're solving rather than anything else.
Absolutely. I agree.
So Vijay, I'm sure that you probably get mobbed by startup founders wherever you go, or wannabe startup founders, whether it's online or offline. And so it's going to be a two-part question. One is going to be if you could just explain very briefly about the work that the Startup Center does. And I know that this is a question that I typically ask towards the end, but I'm going to ask it to you in the beginning. If you had to give the top 2 or the top 3 pieces of advice to anybody who's looking at starting up, who's already started up, what would those be?
So if you are starting up, I would basically say advise in 3 sets, right? Like one is invest in yourself. I think the number of entrepreneurs who basically start off and then basically realize that, hey, I have to apparently understand how finance works. That's something I didn't quite think about. Hey, marketing is something that I quite didn't think about. So when you start off with a single skill set, right? Most of us, by the time we reach 30, we have like a single skill set. We are either a technologist, or we are a great salesperson, or we are a great marketing person. But we haven't built that complementary +1 skill set. And I think for every skill set that you learn, I think your chances of becoming really, really good at the chances of success becomes exponentially higher. A lot of people quote Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs was not just a brilliant marketer. He also understood technology really, really well. He could run the developers conference for Apple and hold his ground just fair and square, right? And I think it's important, like the minute you basically have 2 skill sets, you are way ahead of most, where most entrepreneurs are. So I would say that understand the skill sets, like understand the second thing that I would say is that first time entrepreneurs think products, second time entrepreneurs think distribution. Building a product is great, but if you can't crack distribution, you're going to struggle for a long time. And there is one way to do it is to basically learn this in phases. You build your first company where you build a great product, but it doesn't scale. You shut it down and you build a second company when you realize that, maybe we should have a distribution plan, ahead of time. But understand how distribution works. I know we would love to say that, even when we have conversations about the agri supply chain, for example, why does a farmer get so little and the middleman get so much? That is a very deep disconnect about how distribution works.
Well said. And just a little bit about what the Startup Center is and what is the kind of work that you do as well.
So we predominantly work with early stage entrepreneurs. We have a chain of catchment areas where we basically work with. There is a open community where we basically work with entrepreneurs who are in the idea stage and things like that. A lot of the work that we've been doing, I think, thanks to the last 1 year, had to be repositioned in several ways. It's predominantly gone online. And we do I do one-on-one consult sessions. I work with startups as an investor, as an advisor capacity. I've also been a fractional strategic person for a lot of growth stage companies. So in some of the startups, the founder is holding the fort on the key aspects that brings in the revenue. But then they want to do things like, how do I do my branding and marketing and do market expansion, for example. And I've been working with the entrepreneurs and basically saying, you hold the vision, but let me help you to build some of these other parts that are required. So that's some of the things that I've been doing. Yeah.
No, it sounds like very exciting work, and I'm sure anybody that gets to work with you is definitely very happy.
Vijay, that might be subject to lots of things.
No. From what I see, and I'll touch on social media a little bit as well, because you are somebody who's pretty active and has his finger on the pulse of the startup ecosystem. You also share a lot of your experiences and a lot of your insights online. And one of the things that come across, at least to me, is also the psychology of being a startup founder. And we briefly talked about the entrepreneurial mindset. Again, according to you, in your opinion, what is an entrepreneurial mindset? And is that something that can actually be inculcated or cultivated in a person?
So there are a couple of things I would say, right? Lately, one of the biggest things that I struggle with in India is the mindset of a small business owner versus the mindset of a startup entrepreneur. They're two different things. Building something and there is a mindset of a trader where you buy low, sell high, right? And I think that mentality is prevalent in India. And I think when people say that the Indians have an entrepreneurial mindset, that's what they mean. Like that hustle and that jugaad that goes into place. Unfortunately, that trading mindset really doesn't scale beyond a certain point. So then you basically come into small business, right? Hey, I know how to build this very, great product, but, distribution is a problem. And then there is the product plus distribution plus marketing that I'm able to do, which actually helps you achieve scale, right? The thing that is also something that's very, very important is that 9 out of 10 times the fight for a startup entrepreneur is happening in the mind. There is a lot of stress in building, if you think that building the normal company where you have to meet payroll at the end of the month is hard, you are making large bets and trying to deal with uncertainty. So I think Jeff Bezos said this in one of the interviews about how he makes decisions. He basically says that if you have more than 50% of the information to make a decision, you're very slow, right? So constantly you have only 40% of the information and you need to make a call on things. And working with a mindset where you're actually moving fast and every wrong decision that you make, you're losing a lot of money and there are people's salaries and livelihoods that you're responsible for. The difference between an entrepreneur and a salary person is that, towards the end of the month, the entrepreneur is thinking, how do I meet payroll? Towards the end of the month, the employee is thinking, okay, the month is over, next month's salary is coming. So that pressure, and that sustained pressure that's going to exist for almost 5 years is going to break most normal people. So invest in those things that actually help you. One of the sad things that I've been noticing in the ecosystem is that I think in the last 1.5 years, we lost about 10 or 12 people to suicide in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, right? And very few people talk about it. And, everybody is sad about it. I mean, when the Cafe Coffee Day founder, the unfortunate thing happened, we've forgotten it in about a year's time. But these are, I think it's very important to know that there is the fight that happens in the mind. And most of the battle is about staying, they say running a startup is like being a duck in water, right? So calm outside, but paddling your feet like crazy underwater.
Like crazy. Very true.
And how do you prepare yourself for that? And I think, it's usually life gives you a series of things. And I've seen that a lot of the successful entrepreneurs have had like some deep tragedy or like, extremely hard life growing up, which kind of prepares them for this. But I think there are ways to consciously build that attitude.
I agree. And I think, and I, just like you, I have a lot of first-time founders reaching out to me as well for mentorship and for advice, especially ones that are already holding down jobs and want to make the transition into becoming a founder. For most of them, at least in my opinion, the work also starts before they become a founder and even before they identify the idea or the product or the service they want to get into.
Absolutely.
Whether it is the savings that you have in place, whether it is your relationship with your family or your siblings or your parents or your significant other, and the support system that you have. I think one of the biggest wake-up calls for any founder is when they leave the security of a brand that they work with and they start their own. The number of people that don't answer their phone calls or don't actually come through is, I'm sure, something that's relatable to you as well.
People underestimate the value of the chair that they sit on. I've had IAS officers who quit their jobs and basically become an entrepreneur. And they think like, the world revolves around them. And then the minute they put in their papers, it's over, right? Nobody's taking calls anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that happens.
No, and that can be a very rude wake-up call. And one of the aspects that I wanted you to touch on specifically is the whole fundraising aspect, especially for whether you're a first-time or a second-time entrepreneur. Everybody says bootstrap it as long as you can. If you can afford to, the VCs are evil. VCs are just after their money. What are your thoughts on fundraising and bootstrapping versus getting into the VC cycle?
I don't think there is one way of building a company. Unfortunately, I think the larger ecosystem story, partly because the media tends to focus on fundraising stories as a aspect of glamour, for example. I think there is a lot of hype riding on fundraising, right? Like the chances of you raising money, and there is an increased amount, and especially if you raise money at a high valuation, the chances of you making an exit with something substantial in hand is going to be very, very low. But that's a different story. I think I wouldn't say it should be even a fight between fundraising versus bootstrapping. I think I ask entrepreneurs, what is the outcome that you want? And what is it that will help you to achieve that, right? Maybe what you require is fundraising because, you have ambitions. For example, Chennai is blessed with especially in SaaS, we have two large companies which are taking extremely different poles and going at it, right? Like, we have Zoho, which has taken 25 years to basically build a $400 million revenue company. And then we have Freshworks, which is, in less than about 5-6 years, built, something close to about a $200 million, ARR company. Both are very different aspects, but you have to look at it as the vision of the company is driven by the founder, right? Look at Sridhar's temperament of basically saying, I'm essentially buying myself the liberty so that I can use the capital to invest in other things that I want to do. So he's all about diversifying his impact. Whereas, you look at somebody like Girish who basically says, I want to build a unicorn as fast as possible and build a great company out of India. Neither of the approaches is wrong, but I think you need to know what is it that you want to build. And these are not the only two approaches. I've seen companies where there are 4 or 5 founders who are coming together and basically saying, we're all partners, we'll build companies and we'll do a revenue share model, right? Like a cooperative society of sorts. I think we should be doing more experiments. I believe that there should be like 5 or 6 different models for people to experiment on so that people have ways and means to reach what they want to reach.
Absolutely. And there is no one path to success as they keep talking about it. And it also depends on the risk appetite that you have, right?
Yeah,
as a founder.
I met people who basically said, all I want to do in life is get to 1 crore in assets and then I'm set, right? So why would you want to go fundraise and basically get yourself into a vicious loop, which is not going to end for the next 10 to 15 years if that's the goal? There are faster ways to get to that 1 crore goal.
Very true.
Yeah.
So as far as being a founder, as far as being a startup founder, Vijay, I guess one of the easier things is to convince yourself that I want to become an entrepreneur. Somewhat harder is trying to convince some co-founders to join in hands with you and then eventually building up a team. What are some of your thoughts on first seeking the right co-founder and 2, how do you extend that to a larger team?
So team building is one of the most important aspects, like apart from building an entrepreneurial mindset. That's what I would say, right? Because you would have to learn how to delegate and let go of control, right? Like being able to effectively communicate vision rather than basically always being that one-man army. I mean, that is the issue that a lot of promoters actually have in India, where they have a great business, but they don't know how to let go of control to let it scale. I think when it comes to finding a co-founder, one of the questions that I ask co-founders that I meet is like, how many times have you fought? Which is the biggest fight that you have had? And how did you resolve that disagreement, right? And a lot of them basically say, we don't fight. I said, then you're not ready to start a company yet. Like, go have your fight first. Because it's really not about disagreements, but like, how do you know how to resolve those disagreements, right? And most of the times I've basically found that co-founders who last, because I know I did a survey about like 3-4 years ago where somebody said like, 60 or 62% of the founders, startups fail because of co-founder issues. And it's all rosy in the beginning, right? Like, when you start off, everybody is optimist. Everybody basically believes that they're going to build a unicorn. I think it's only when the times get tough and everybody gets pulled in different directions of priority, the whole relationship gets strained. Start with somebody that you know. I think that's a lot easier. If you probably were one of those folks who went to an engineering college, ended up with a pool of working for the tech department where you didn't actually go and meet people from the sales and marketing department, for example, find a friend of a friend who probably will make an introduction for you. And I think most of the time, those are the relationships that last. I would say start a project together and see if you can survive. And then think about like, doing a startup together, because unlike a marriage where you can basically get a divorce and walk away, this is a lot more complicated because, your co-founder is already vested. So, even if the person is disengaged, all the hard work that you're doing is essentially creating value for them. And I know a lot of remorseful entrepreneurs basically say, I'm working here like 12 hours a week or a day. My co-founder is like, completely disengaged and I'm creating wealth for him. I don't know why, right?
Absolutely. And the more successful the company gets, the more you have at stake as well.
Yeah. And that gets all complicated. So I would suggest like, start a company with somebody that you trust and believe in, like, and also it goes with that first 20 people that you build, right? Like one of the mentors that I work with, he constantly keeps asking me when I meet people, he says, is this a person that you would casually have dinner with, even if there was nothing to talk about? Like, is this a person that you genuinely like hanging out with? Because those 20 people will define the culture of the company, right? And but if those disagreements happen, and when the company scales to 200 or 2,000 people, it's going to be very hard because that person is not going to change. They're just going to become a thorn in the side.
True. So would you recommend, especially for the first co-founder or two, I mean, depending on who it is, finding somebody with complementary skill sets or finding somebody with diverse skill sets as opposed to what you have?
You can do both. I've seen both work. It's important to know that you actually respect that person in something, right? So I could be the guy who's basically handling product, but there is another person who is like phenomenal in marketing. And I know when to step back and say, I know this is a marketing decision. I'm going to let him take the call on that, right? That amicable trust, even though like, we might both be coming from an MBA school, for example, but that amicable trust and respect that we have for the other person. I saw this really nice tool called the Predictive Index. And what it actually does is that it does this psychological mapping of the person, like, and where their strengths lie and stuff like that. And it also does this like overlapping areas, like, where this person actually, this person likes to make controlled decisions. And, this person doesn't like to make decisions, for example, and like where the overlaps are, so that like when you're forming teams itself, you basically say, these are all areas that we need to have a discussion about like right now. Rather than both of them doing that. Like one of the other things that I would also say is that just because 3 people are coming together and starting a company, don't basically say it's going to be a 33% split. And having that very conscious call saying that, hey, that person is the CEO and I'm going to give him about like, 40% of the company and the rest of us are going to split 30%. Structurally sets up the company that hierarchy is very, very well defined.
True. No, and I think that's just the beginning of the conversation, right? Because how do you decide how much effort every person is going to put in, how much time is going to put in? I've met co-founders as well that some of them are still holding on to their jobs while other co-founders have left and are working on the startup full time. and it gets, like you said, everything needs to be clarified upfront and preferably written down as well.
And it could very well be that the person who's working is probably pumping in money into the company as well, right? Early
Correct.
on when you read it. So I think those are all all those factors have to be factored in. And it actually helps to have that clarity that when I meet people who are more than one co-founder, I actually ask them the same question, right? Who's the CEO? And they basically say, oh, we're both CEOs. I'm like, this is not going to work. You clearly define who's the CEO, because one of them is going to be in the meeting and one of them will have to take calls. If both of you have to be everywhere, this is the most inefficient team ever. So somebody will have to take the lead on a lot of things. And the last thing that I will also say is that you don't need to necessarily have a co-founder. There are lots of people whom I figured out, they really work well as a solo founder who would like to hire other people who basically, and that hierarchy working really, really well. And if that's your game, just do that. Don't get a co-founder because everybody else is getting a co-founder.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, whatever works, right?
Yeah.
So extending that sense of team membership to a larger community, I know that everybody nowadays is talking about community building. We talk about Substack. We talk about, podcasts. We talk about talk shows. I understand you have your own newsletter as well.
Yes, I do.
So what are your thoughts on community building, and what has the response been to your newsletter, and how often does it go out and all of that?
The topic of community has been something that I've been mulling over for the last 2 years, partly because, I am engaged in ecosystem building activities in Chennai. I also play a part with a lot of the government policies for the state and in a couple of states and things like that. And I also see a lot of companies now talking about community increasingly, right? And one of the clarity that I've gotten in the last couple of months, and especially after this lockdown happened because everybody had to move online, is that I think there are varied levels of communities. There are most open communities, I would say, are a funnel into a larger sales funnel, right? If it is free and if it's open, it is a sales funnel for something else. I think let's be clear about it. And if it is really not a sales funnel for something else, I don't see such communities last for a long time, because, the energy runs out at some point, it basically just fizzles out. The thing that I also realize is that when you're building an ecosystem, you're almost building a forest, right? When you're building communities, you're building gardens, and gardens require a gardener. If the gardener doesn't show up for a week, the garden is done, right? It dies off. A forest lasts, So one of the things that I also noticed is that forests are stuff that you actually build as a public good. A lot of the time, you basically have to say that, and it's usually built as entrepreneurs who actually benefited out of a smaller, the ecosystem, basically saying that I understand the value of an ecosystem, or I miss an ecosystem, because I came back from Canada where I was very engaged with an ecosystem, and I kept the first interaction of coming to India was meeting Professor Jhunjhunwala and IIT Madras and basically saying, if somebody was an entrepreneur and had an idea, where do they go? And he said, I don't know. So I said, maybe that's what we should do, right? So that's where the whole proto journey and everything started.
Got it.
So I think when you're building larger communities, which are forests, it's usually because people are giving back. And a larger ecosystem is only valuable because people give more than they take. And I think that's very important. Like, I see a lot of people where they basically get into a Facebook group and the first thing that they post is like, I have a product, I'm looking for customers. I'm like, what is the give? First, you start giving and then you can start thinking about taking, right? And that happens in society as well, right? And I think we've been building for communities as long as we know. And communities come together because there's a shared vision, purpose, and a goal that we want to achieve. Or maybe we have a common adversity. Maybe there is a large mammoth sitting outside or a saber-toothed tiger sitting outside. So we basically realize that instead of one person, it makes a lot of sense for 4 or 5 of us to come together and fend off.
Of course.
So that's where, and I think the difference that I see between forests and communities, it's that, or a garden, for example, is that it's this interesting realization that all forests are named after the trees, right? We talk about mangrove forest, we talk about the redwood forest, we talk about the Sundarbans or the marshlands. But when we talk about parks, we always talk about the person's name attached. It's Lal Bagh Park, right? It's most parks are a personality centric thing, right? And I'm not saying that the members don't benefit out of it, but there is a vested interest for the person who's curating it to get something out of it. Now the equation shifts a lot when it's a paid community because users actually have a benefit. Now I'm a member, so I can basically ask what I'm getting out of it. The worst is when there is a community model and it is actually driven, it's meant for the founder or for the person who's curating it rather than the members. And I think that's when politics begin, right? Like, so because the whole thing basically becomes about the person rather than the members. And then becomes turf war and all those issues basically start. So I think there is a long and complicated thing as to like, what kind of community are you building and what is the intent for, as to what you're building for.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great metaphor between the forest and the park as well. Because, and a lot of people make this mistake when they're building a community, that you have to understand that not everybody in your audience is a fan or is a client. Yeah. So are you okay with building a community for the sake of, like you said, either a common good or to be able to give back in some way, because that's the way that you've learned as well.
So one of the things that I'm doing with this newsletter is that I think I reached about 1,000 subscribers or so. So every month, one of the things that I do is that, let's say that I think last month there were about 95 or 96 people who subscribed. I went through the list and basically saw who were the lowest 93 people. So there were some people who had had not opened the newsletter in the last 2 months. So I removed all of those 94 people. I want to keep it to 1,000. And I basically say that how do you build this highly engaged 1,000 people for whom this content actually makes sense? If it's not valuable to you that you open it, maybe it's time to gracefully let you go so that I'm not cluttering your inbox, right?
I think that's a great way to think about it. And what is the kind of content that you put out, Vijay, if I may ask?
So I'm increasingly thinking about this phrase got stuck in my head about remarkable startups, right? Building a startup that people talk about and people miss if it's not there, right? And I think over the last 15 years, I know as we mentioned, there's a lot craze about which startup should I start to get funded and all those things. But there are these entrepreneurs who basically say, I want to build something that is valuable. So I'm basically saying, okay, for these founders, what are the kind of things that we need to talk about? So I'm trying to build this tribe of 1,000 entrepreneurs who are building remarkable startups or trying or want to.
So that your legacy is going to be built on other people's legacy. Is that what you're planning to do?
I hope so. I think, I've always basically said that 10 years down the line, for example, when we launched Proto, right? Like companies like Myntra basically benefited out of that. I know that they raised money from Proto. Ixigo came out of that. Dhruva came out of that. So there were quite a few companies that actually came out of that. It would be nice that, whatever I'm doing right now, 10 years from now, I can basically say, what, these companies came out of that effort, right? Being able to point at a company and basically say that, you see the beginnings of a company like Ather, for example. I played a small part in companies like that. I feel a lot more immense job satisfaction out of that rather than basically saying, we built a company, we sold it in 6 months, we got some cash, now we're on to the next thing.
No, it sounds like a very engaged community, and I'd love to sign up for the newsletter as well. Moving on to some other things that a founder does or doesn't do. A founder always has too many things to do and not enough time during the day to get it done. And one of those things is that what are the tasks that I should focus on daily versus, when we talk about operational versus strategic. So when do you know when to zoom in or when do you know when to zoom out? What are your thoughts on, developing that range of thinking or that range of planning?
So anything that doesn't actually help in creating assets, I think you need to find a way to delegate, or you basically need to outsource it, right? So people ask me quite a few times, does it really important that I get a tech co-founder? And I ask them, are you building a tech company or are you building a tech-enabled company? If you're building a tech-enabled company, you can absolutely make do with outsourcing the tech, because that's really not the main deal, right? You can build a company like a food delivery company for which the operational logistics is more important than the app. You can find a great company that can build an equivalent of a Zomato or a Swiggy for you, at least to start off with. And then you can basically decide, do you want to basically move that team in-house, because you can get iterations going on much faster. And I think that thing is very, very important. What I'm doing, is that actually creating that asset flywheel, which will basically create that perpetual value for the company. right?
Okay.
But if I'm like doing like picking up stuff and dropping things off because it needs to be done, I think it's a gross, undervaluation of the founder's time. I think it's nice to say that as a founder, I do everything from, running board meetings to be keeping the bathroom clean. But at some point, you need to jot down things and basically say, if my time is worth this much, then I should be at least creating value that is twice that, and basically find somebody else to go pick up coffee for the rest of the team members, right?
Very true.
Yeah.
No, and I think that becomes easier the more that you progress in your journey. But in the beginning, everything is very confusing, right? Because you've got so much to do and you don't have anybody essentially to delegate it to.
Yeah, but I also think that finding that clarity as early as possible is what's going to get you to that product market fit and things like that. So do, less, do less with high impact. And I think that is that matrix that I basically use, and I think I shared it with my community as well, saying that what is that high effort, high output task that needs to get done, rather than basically saying that low impact, low, high effort task, which needs to be delegated out, right?
Very true.
So have that matrix, which will basically help you, because even if it's your founding team of 2 or 3 people, and automate things as much as possible, right? If there is a scheduling call that you're doing, if you're building a content platform, for example, there are so many tools that are available that even if you have to pay the $20 to basically make sure that things are automated, if it is process, go from tasks that need to be done to making them process oriented to automating them. Right? The more number of times that the key to building a startup is building value in a repeatable fashion, right? Okay. So if you do something once and it creates value, great. But how do I do it over and over again and with speed and with more efficacy as I grow, right? If I can do that, then I have a startup flywheel. It's simple as that.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great quote from the conversation. And that's what startups are about, essentially, that you should be able to scale up a process that doesn't take you as much time as it did the first time.
Yeah, and you should be doing less, not trying to do more. I meet startup founders which end up having feature creep, right? Like we do this, and then you meet a potential person who might be a customer, and you basically meet that person and you say, what do you do? And you basically say something else. But in order to use our product, they need 7 more things, right? And I basically say, let's go build that thing also, right? And you're building something for everybody, and you end up building nothing for nobody. And I think that becomes a problematic thing.
Agreed. Taking a step back also, and we talk about founders and we talk about co-founders, what are your thoughts on, and we talk about real life skills, what are your thoughts on the importance of communication skills for founders? I know that not a lot of colleges or schools or high schools focus on those aspects, whether it's public speaking or whether it is sales pitches or whether it is just standing up and articulating yourself either in a newsletter or offline. Is that one of the key aspects or key skills that a founder needs to build up?
It once again goes back to what is this? Are you building a tech company, or are you building a technology-enabled company, or are you building a B2C company or a B2B company or a B2BC company? Like, for example, I know that I'm terribly bad at mass communication. So I stay away from B2C companies. I have lots of admiration for the guts that B2C founders have, right? Because I understand when I can talk to B2B founders and ask the customers and ask them what is it that they are going to require. And I can actually tweak things to basically achieve product market fit. B2C seems to be like this one of those wild things where you have to try a lot of things and some might work and might not work. I think that really takes a lot of if you think that a B2B founder has to have this level of mental temperament, going on, I think as a B2C founder, I think it's 10x that. But I think that's why guys like Kunal Shah, who understand psychology really, really well, do phenomenally well in places like that, right? So understand, communication also has varied levels. If you need to be able to articulate your vision to somebody else who can basically, join in on that vision. And I think that is basic level of, hey, can I find a kindred spirit and basically convince them to join me, right? I might be terrible still at mass communicating with a larger world. But if I'm able to find a great marketing person whom I can convince, a Steve Jobs convincing a Guy Kawasaki so that he can go ahead marketing for Apple, I think that's great, right? So being able to recruit that key set of people, like Bill Gates was not a great communicator for a long time. You look at these early interviews, you look at a Mark Zuckerberg, he needed a coach like, Eric Schmidt coming in and basically helping him out to basically become this larger personality, because some of his early interviews with the public were terrible, because he kept going and saying that, we're going to do whatever we want to do. How does it matter? Because he was coming from that Silicon Valley mindset where, you build, you move fast and break things, which is not what the world wants to hear when democratic institutions are getting eroding because you have a platform like Facebook. But I think he evolved rather quickly. A lot of founders might not. And I think that's when the honorable thing to do is to basically step back and find a new CEO to come in. So I think communications has various levels. If you're a B2B, if you're not a person who is very comfortable public speaking and you're not the flamboyant VC and stuff like that, not entrepreneur, stuff like that, then find something that suits your personality. I've seen founders who are really, really good with their tech community, like Tanmay, who's running Hazura, for example. He is brilliant with tech engineers and tech guys, right? Or the guys who are building Postmates, for example. They are not great with, doing a larger communication, but for the copy on the website, they'll probably hire a marketing person to do it. But they are the geniuses when, they have an audience of 100 tech guys sitting there and they're speaking to them because they resonate really, really well.
And they literally speak the same language, so to speak.
So having that ability is important. Like otherwise, you're just like, a crank in the room because nobody really understands what you're doing.
Absolutely. And I think it sounds like a very basic thing to say. And people have probably been saying it for decades, if not centuries, that learn to focus on what your strengths are rather than trying to be everything to everyone. And also be okay with your ego that you don't have to do everything in your company. And it's okay to push the CMO forward, or the CFO forward, or even the CTO forward, to be able to take the public limelight as and when required.
Yeah, or find a co-founder who's this vocal, loves to be the social butterfly who goes to all these parties and events. Like, as long as you're fine with that. I know a company where the co-founder is this really shy type who's the operations person. And there is the other so-called CEO who does far little time at the company, but he does valuable work and he does all the social networking. And by virtue of that, he also gets most of the press, right? I think it's important for us to also know that, hey, I am this quiet type and I'm going to not be I know that there was a time when I sat them both down, and especially when they were both about to get married, saying that have this conversation with your family, because I don't want your family coming back and saying that, you're working 12 hours a day, but you don't even become a mention. Like, the Baiju is run by Baiju, like, who's the, most people think of him as the co-founder, but he's also a husband of this partner. But when people, he is proud enough to put his name on the company, right? It's Absolutely. Not even, but having that comfort factor is very, very important. And knowing what is the role that you're taking and what is the other person doing, that's a conversation that needs to be had. Otherwise, it creates unwanted friction.
Very true. Especially when you start getting questions like, where is your ET Now article, or where is your, why aren't you featured on the CEO's chair, or why is somebody else going, and so on and so forth.
Like Freshworks, right? I think his co-founder is this guy called, Sean Krishnaswamy, but he's the CTO. He only likes to deal with engineers and machines. Apparently, it was very, very obvious when they started off saying that I want to only deal with people who build stuff and with computers. I don't want to deal with people. So whenever, it's a unicorn, but you can ask 10 founders in the ecosystem, who is the founder of Freshworks, and they'll probably tell you Girish. And they're probably never going to mention Sean at all, right? But he's okay with it.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's the most important statement, being okay with it.
Yeah.
So Vijay, you've been part of the startup ecosystem since 2004, which is almost 15, 16 years now. I'm sure you've noticed a sea change. And like we were discussing offline a little bit earlier, where people have gone from running to find jobs with the Infosys and the Wipros of the world to now you have college students that are turning down job offers from Google and TCS and so on. What are some realistic expectations that a startup founder should or should not have from the larger ecosystem, so to speak?
So one of the funny things in Proto, when Proto was started in 2004 and it was going on till 2008, I remember having this conversation with a bunch of people, and I think there was a journalist also available there. I think it was Chandra, who now is with Money Control. I think she was at that time just entering journalists. She was just becoming a journalist. She just graduated. So a lot of these journalists actually came up together. And I know that she was asking, when do you think that an ecosystem has arrived? And I basically said that, when a father-in-law is perfectly fine with a startup founder marrying his daughter, because you can convince a venture capitalist that, you will make it. But a father is going to be super protective of his kids, right? So when the potential in-laws are comfortable with you starting a company and building a company, and I know that 2008, 2009 timeframe, that tide started to change. So almost in about 4 or 5 years, running a startup became very, very fashionable. So there are, the perception about an ecosystem and building that, hey, in India, you can be an entrepreneur and a startup is something that is the job of an ecosystem, right? Because you don't have to go fight with your family saying that everybody else is starting a company, or, there are people who have succeeded starting a company. So I should also do it. Now, what is the other thing that an entrepreneur is going to find it very, very hard? Government policies and things like that. So there are people like myself, there are people like iSpirit, there are people like SaaSBoomi, there are organizations like TIE, which all basically make sure that some of the larger government policies, basically don't stand in the way of an entrepreneur. But I have seen entrepreneurs who basically come and say, when I ask them, when I meet some entrepreneurs and basically they say the ecosystem is not there, I basically say, what are you expecting? They said, it'd be nice if I can find co-founders. It'd be nice if I can find people who will build products. It'll be nice if I can find customers. It'd be nice if, VCs come looking for you. And I'm like, so exactly what is it that you do, right? If all of these things have to happen on its own, what is it that you do? It's not going to happen, right? Because if everything is set by default, then it's a job, right? Then if anybody can become an entrepreneur, then the payout is also not as high. The reason why people become entrepreneurs is because, like a Sachin Bansal, barely before he reached 30, he's a qualified billionaire, walked away with 6,000 crores of, white cash in the country, right? And we are seeing, and we will see a lot more of those folks happening who can go on to make larger, bigger bets. We all decided to get on the fast track to creating wealth, right? So that we can go create this larger impact, I would say impact rather than basically saying wealth, for whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I believe an ecosystem, and I think I've said it in several places, that entrepreneurs create ecosystems, not ecosystems creating entrepreneurs, right? Like the Sridhar Vembu basically 25 years ago, basically saying while everybody was building services company, him basically say, what I'm going to do? I think the next wave of the future is products, and we're going to build SaaS companies, right? And at the time when we were still sitting on, capped broadband, happening all over the country. And I think 25 years ago, we didn't even have broadband. We were still sitting on, 2G and
dial-ups, of course.
Dial-ups. So having that vision so early on, saying that the future is SaaS products across the world, that is going against the tide, right? People like that who have basically, and Chennai was not even the de facto place, right? No, I know that the office that they used to have had nothing, but there was IIT, and 5 kilometers later, there was the AdventNet office. And they were there because they couldn't afford place inside the city, so to speak. Now the city has become that. So it is entrepreneurs who basically build that vortex around which everything happens. Now, obviously, there are entrepreneurs who benefit out of it, right? Like because of a Sridhar, there is and I keep referring to Zoho as the old banyan tree in the SaaS ecosystem. There are a lot of these little saplings that grow around it in the shade, right?
Correct.
Like we don't have to bear the scorch of the sun. We can basically grow under its shadow, but we have to be, and then there is a third generation of entrepreneurs who are going to basically ride the wave of, the Freshworks and all those things, where they basically build something very, very small. They'll probably build something, raise $300,000 or $500,000 in capital, for example, or maybe they'll have their own capital. They'll sell it for $10 million because they won't be able to scale beyond that, right? The payouts are also going to become much smaller. But the larger returns are always going to happen for entrepreneurs who take that pivot that nobody else thought about, right?
I think even Nitin Kamath and Zero Da is a phenomenal example.
Yeah.
And, we talk about an overnight success story, which took 25 years to build. That's something similar that, and whenever anybody asks him, he's like, I've been at it since the age of 19 or 18 when I was day trading, and people didn't even know what day trading was.
Yeah. And 25 years, right? We get tired when we can't keep up, we can't even be outraged about an issue for more than a month, Right? So keeping at it for 25 years, day in and day out. And I think that's when that ritual, and like you have to have really strong convictions to wake up in the morning and show up at work, because that is half the fight. And like, day in and day out and keep slogging at it. Because it takes about like 5 years to just merely figure out whether the startup that you're working on will make sense or not. Right? And probably another 10 years to basically achieve the kind of scale that it needs to.
And not just motivate yourself, but to keep others motivated as well.
Yeah. And all the ecosystems, like, the good thing about India is now each one of the cities are now developing their own brand, right? Like Chennai is becoming a SaaS ecosystem. Hyderabad is becoming biotech. And Hyderabad is becoming biotech because Dr. Reddy's is there. Like all the companies that you see like, Dr. Reddy's, right? And you see companies like e-commerce and stuff like that happening in Bangalore because the Flipkart or the Amazon was actually there, and they inculcated that brand of that early domain knowledge again, that was needed to build that ecosystem.
Absolutely. So Vijay, this is such an enthralling conversation. We could keep going for hours, but I know that we need to cut it short. So a couple of final questions. I've actually got two questions from the audience. One is from Radhika, who's asking that, in your opinion, Vijay, what do you think that women entrepreneurs or women startup founders need to do differently than their male counterparts?
So this is a question that is a bit of a pickle. I know that we had this conversation about it, and I was like, how am I going to tackle this? Because I think there is nothing worse than a guy basically saying how women entrepreneurship should go ahead. So this is an interesting realization that I came upon a couple of weeks ago. Because I saw Chamath basically putting up this tweet saying that, I started off with zero inheritance and I made it all out on my own. And when I thought about it, and I was talking to a couple of entrepreneurs, and it was just in the back of my mind, I was just mulling over it. And I was speaking to an entrepreneur who really can't start up right now because, he has a family that is dependent on him. There is an EMI that is running. There is his extended, parents that he's taking care of and things like that, right? And I realized that starting off at zero is not really the worst thing that can happen to you, because zero with confidence and ability is still infinite possibilities. I think women entrepreneurs, and I know that a couple of years ago there is this group called Women in Tech. And I gave them my office to meet here. And I basically told them, you guys can meet here with the condition that I can just listen. Like, I don't want to talk. Please don't ask me any questions. I just want to sit there and basically listen to your conversations, right? And women entrepreneurs have this innate expectations that there are certain roles that they're supposed to play, right? Okay. Like, they're supposed to have children, they're supposed to raise kids, and, family is supposed to be prioritized more than anything else. What you will also realize is that there are certain areas where I've seen women entrepreneurs being a lot more than men entrepreneurs. Like, you look at the finance sector, for example, there are a lot more women and women entrepreneurs in the country. You look at the education sector, there are a lot more women and women entrepreneurs in the country. You look at the healthcare sector, for example, there are a lot of women and women entrepreneurs in the country.
True.
And I realized that instead of fighting, it goes back to leveraging our strengths and leveraging our, what is it that we are fighting the grain against. Correct. I think it's important for women entrepreneurs to basically also leverage the strengths that they have, right? And basically build, rather than basically saying that, we want to do everything that we want to do. But this is a note for me, because as ecosystem builders, I think we have to take a cue that there are certain people who are, the ecosystem is biased towards because there is societal expectations. So we have to make means and ways happen so that women entrepreneurs, if they want to build an e-commerce company or a tech business, the ecosystem is really not standing in the way, but will facilitate that. And I think, the larger thing of leaving things better than we found them, those are all some of the aspects that we as ecosystem builders have to do. But I think as women entrepreneurs, you will also, like all things, right? Like, value building is a step function. Whether you are a male founder or a women co-founder, or you're a third gender person who's basically starting a company, the key is to basically build something, prove it, and then go build on top of that, right? Like, so value building is a step function. I know a lot of people who want to build the first company, which becomes $1 billion company.
Absolutely.
But I think, having that body of work, which is what I keep telling people, having that body of work that you can showcase to say that I am good at what I'm good at, is the best defense that you can have to basically fight for equality.
No, I think that's a great point, Vijay, that a lot of people wait for confidence to come and then they start with the competence part. But a lot of people forget that the competence actually starts first, and then the confidence just follows automatically. And everybody loves a success story, right?
Yeah.
Once you're a success, nobody cares whether you're male, female, transgender, whatever it is. As long as you have a successful business, you're good to go.
Absolutely.
And I think one final question, and I believe this is from Sanjay. He says that, Vijay, you mentioned that co-founder issues is the number one reason why startups don't work and startups fail. What are some of the more common issues that you've come across why startups don't work?
Timing the market, I really think is very, very hard, right? Like you could do everything right and the market can still say I'm going to do what I'm going to do. There are so many companies that I know, one of the, when I meet a couple of these aspiring entrepreneurs, they ask me, hey, can you tell me where I can go find startup ideas? And one of the things that I've been writing about is, here are some areas in startups that, I really wish somebody would build a company on. So that's one of the segments that I write on. I tell them go find companies that were too early for their day, 10 years ago and died, and maybe see whether they can be applied right now. You'll have to do a lot of modifications. Maybe it's not a web first, maybe it's a mobile first right now. So you'll probably have to think a lot about it from that point of view. But maybe the market is a lot more ready right now because there is UPI in place right now. So you can collect payments a lot more easily compared to how it was maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, for example, right?
Absolutely.
So market regulations, for example, and the larger sentiments of things like the pandemic, nobody really can do much about it, right? But I do see lack of clarity being, apart from co-founder issues.
Mm-hmm.
I meet a lot of entrepreneurs when I ask them how will you, I know that this is where you are and this is where you want to get to, how will you get there? And it's always we'll somehow get there. And that's not really a strategy, right? That's hope. And hope is really not a strategy, right? And it's also very sad because, when you sit in board meetings, you always see this, how did we do last quarter? We were loss making. How did we do next quarter? It looks like we will be loss making. But what is the projection for the quarter after that? We will be making a U-curve, right? It's going to be a rocket jump. And I'm like, what are we doing in the third quarter that is different from what we're doing right now? We will figure something, right? And I think coming up with that tactical approach, and I think the whole OKR frameworks that a lot of startups are adopting is helpful to basically say, what am I going to do? And realistically, if we ask ourselves the tough question, the market will not force us to basically, ask us those questions.
No, I completely agree. And sometimes, like they say, that a bad plan is better than not having a plan at all. And I think a lot of startups, because at least you can pivot, you can iterate, you can go back to it and figure out what worked versus what did.
And also think about the negative use cases, right? I am constantly thinking, whenever a company tells me a bigger strategy that they're talking about, I ask them, what is the best thing that can happen? What is the worst thing that can happen? And reality is going to be most probably going to be halfway in between. Correct. Right? Everybody thinks about the most optimistic scenario that, when reality happens, they're a little disappointed because it didn't quite pan out. But they might be surprised because it could go the opposite way also.
Absolutely. So great, Vijay. Any last thoughts, any last pieces of advice or wisdom for us before we call it a day?
I think the key thing, I know that I also mentioned that, B2C is something that I'm a little scared of, partly because learn what the larger, because they say it's important to be able to read the market. And whenever they say read the market, what does it mean? It's really not the stock market. You need to understand the larger ecosystem, right? And I see that, and I think this is something that a lot of people have been talking about as of late. When India reaches that magical, 5,000 per capita GDP, a lot of things will happen. B2C will start scaling, because in China, it was roughly around 3,000. I believe that in India, it will roughly be around 5,000. But it is a long way there. We don't know when we will get there. Is it going to take 10 years? Is it going to take a generation to get there? So in the meantime, I think B2B is something that will scale, because when businesses scale, employment is going to scale, which is going to help us to get to that B2C quickly. Right. So I think it's important to know, where is the B2B, B2B2C model, which will probably lead to a B2C thing. And I feel that entrepreneurs having this clarity, rather than being too emotional, whenever I say this to people, they're like, are you a person who doesn't believe in India? I absolutely believe in India. That's why I'm still sitting here, right? We're all sitting here otherwise because we would have moved easily to some other market. I believe it, but it's also important to be, rational about it and know like, okay, this will lead to that, that will lead to that, so that you can time the market right.
Absolutely. No, I think there's been some great insights, and I can't believe that it's almost been an hour since we've been talking. But Vijay, thank you so much for taking time out to have this conversation with us. We wish you and Startup Center nothing but the best. And hopefully I look forward to catching up with you in person next time that I'm in Chennai or you're in Pune.
Look forward. Thank you very much, Siddharth. I really
Thank you very much, Vijay. And thank you everyone for watching another exciting episode of the CEO's Chair. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Take care. Bye. Thank you, Vijay. Take care.